let's go ahead and get started. I just wanted to thank everyone for being here on behalf of the Makuho Program Committee, and thank you for presenting, John. At the end of the session, I will put an evaluation in the chat. Please review that evaluation. It will also be available on the conference platform if you are interested in taking it after the fact. Without further ado, feel free.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And welcome everyone. Kind of thank you for attending. I always appreciate kind of people kind of attending, and whenever I usually get the chance to kind of present at conferences, I usually get that coveted right after lunchtime spot. So having something a little different where people are bright-eyed in the morning, very appreciative. So, but yeah, again, I'll probably kind of jump in terms of trying to share my screen at least, and we'll see where that kind of takes me. Boom. Okay, and hopefully everyone can kind of see that. And we'll kind of go from there, monitor any kind of questions or anything like that. Hopefully we'll be able to kind of see if anyone has any questions as we kind of go along, and yeah, we'll take things from there. Again, my name is John Michael Hackey. I'm assistant director at Morehead State University, which is just out of the Makuho region, just over that West Virginia border there. So close, and I promise I won't start any Hatfield or McCoy kind of stuff, just being over the border. So, and yeah. And so if you kind of, my goal kind of here, like when we talk about a lot of the like kind of advice or kind of things that we would kind of, that I would give to kind of professionals, or how we kind of go about some different things. That's really kind of the goal for this. And so just to give you a little bit of kind of my background, kind of my journey. Oops, make sure, there we go. Again, a little insight for me. I'm originally from outside of Cleveland, Ohio. Kind of born and raised, kind of rightly or wrongly in terms of how much football I have to actually root for at certain times, but hope is always there. And so from there, kind of did my undergraduate at Indiana University. Love my time there. It's where I kind of developed my passion for working in housing and student affairs. And so knowing that the next step for me was always going to be a master's degree, that's what took me out to Las Vegas, of all places, to get that master's degree. Ironically, where most people go out to Vegas for recess, I went for school, but love my time out there. Vegas is a very unique place. And so, and I kind of talk about my journey being very lucky, having a lot of different experiences. And so, from there, having two different ACU Hawaii internships, one at Texas Tech, one in Western Michigan, starting my professional career at a small community college in Eastern Utah. And then being able to kind of travel some additional positions at the University of Kentucky, University of Michigan, and then that's what's kind of landed me here at Morehead State, and kind of that assistant director role. And so I kind of share that journey a little bit just to kind of put into context of kind of how I tend to kind of present or kind of tie things together. And a lot of that will come through the stories and experiences that I've had through this journey over the course of in accumulation about 18 to 20 years in and around student housing. And so a lot of the topics and a lot of the things that that I'm going to talk a little bit about have come through things of either conversations I tend to have with people, or just experiences or things that I've kind of learned along the way. Maybe sometimes a little bit the hard way, sometimes a little bit just through observations. One of the things, as an undergrad at Indiana, one of my majors was folklore, and it was very much about stories and context and kind of how those things get transmitted and passed along. And so, it's something that's always had a place in my heart, and so trying to find ways to do that, and realize that that's kind of the goal for kind of this, is just to be able to kind of share some of those things that I've kind of learned, and maybe some of those things that when we go through our a graduate program or some kind of degree program may not necessarily get talked about, but are good things for people to kind of keep in mind as they kind of go about their career, whether that's passing knowledge on to others or just how they kind of manage their own kind of work on a day-to-day basis. And so yeah. So kind of my first story that I kind of pull from, it comes from selection. We've all kind of gone through kind of job processes and those kind of things. And, it comes with when I was a part of kind of a hall director selection committee. And we were kind of doing our search for one of our hall director positions. And, we had a candidate that, was recommended to us by our senior student affairs officer. You know, with someone they said, hey, I've worked with this person before at a different school. You know, I trust them. You know, I am, and you know, really hard worker, really good. And so I was like, okay, you know, we're basing on kind of that recommendation. You know, kind of went through the phone interview. We were able to kind of sit there and invite them to campus, and then went through the campus interview. Wasn't necessarily the best showing for the candidate, and so we at that point we kind of chose to kind of go with another individual through that search. And when we kind of communicated to that candidate that was recommended to us about like, hey, you know, thank you for interviewing with us. We've checked it. We've selected another candidate for this position. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask us, and kind of sending that formal communication in terms of kind of wrapping up that process. Well, the response we got from that candidate was along the lines of a direct contact to our director, informing him of all the things that that candidate felt was wrong with our process and was not exactly communicated in the most friendly tone. And so anyone want to take a guess? Either you can kind of unmute or otherwise, where our first communication was after we got that response from that candidate?
To the person who referred them?
Yep. And that was one of those things, just, it was more so out of that professional courtesy of just saying like, hey, just an FYI, you know, this is kind of where, you know, on what we got in response. And so, I mean, we were going to respond kind of like, hey, you know, thank you for your feedback, and kind of navigate through some of those things. But a lot of it was kind of making sure that, hey, this was someone who kind of reached out and kind of vouched for this person. You know, you may also want to have a conversation with them as well about kind of maybe not necessarily what was communicated, but kind of the manner in which, you know, it was communicating. So I always kind of use that story to kind of highlight for when I talk to professionals in kind of other areas, and knowing that this was something that happened a long time ago, at least now. You know, when we talk about this idea of the legacy that you carry and kind of how you represent those around you, I think a lot of times when we talk about representation, we tend to think a lot about kind of where we are in the here and now. And so like I said, I would think maybe on a day-to-day basis, I represent Morehead State, you know, through like conferences and those kind of things. But it's also keeping in mind kind of some of those things that we carry with us, and so those communities that we kind of carry with us. And so if you think about just this idea of where you learn about the quality of certain things, especially in and around our industry, you know, how is it that you evaluate a reputation of degree programs that we're looking at? How do we evaluate, you know, a reputation of departments that we're looking at, maybe even including our own, or the school in general? Where are we learning those things? Where are we kind of learning a lot of those things? And we can go online and do a lot of searches, you know, about like, oh, this is what this department does, or kind of these are reviews of kind of these programs. But I would bet if we kind of really think about kind of how we form those opinions, a lot of it comes from the individuals that we've had the opportunity to interact with, and those people that we have worked with. You know, I can, and I think a lot about, especially as we kind of go through searches, and I work with kind of our search committees now, we talk about bias in our searches. And so one of those things that I always bring up is kind of how we judge and kind of what our experiences are with like the degree programs and how we evaluate some of those qualities. Because we'll sit there and know, you know, we've worked with people, oh, this person came from this school, you know, hey, they were really great to work with, seemed really good. You know, that becomes a reflection on kind of the program that maybe they came from, versus some other people who may have been a little less impressive. And suddenly we think, okay, well, is that a reflection of their experience of their degree program? And so when we think about kind of what that is, it's kind of always keeping in mind kind of, again, more often than not, the term legacy gets used in relation to like Greek life and kind of how legacies kind of travel through that system. But really, like I said, within our own thing, within our own system, and kind of the own way we do those things and how we represent ourselves and kind of the path that we've had and the journey and those different stops that we've had, we have that as well, and kind of how those things kind of play out. So, and again, when we think about kind of ourselves and when we go out and how we represent those things, you know, those areas, again, employers, current, previous, you know, degrees. Show of hands, how many people have their college degrees hanging in their office? So we put those things front and center of like, here are the places we represent, that we're proud to represent those things. So how do we kind of do some of those things? And so when we talk about, especially like ethical practices or professional standards and those kind of things, you know, those are things that carry forward and we carry with us. We wear them on our sleeve. You know, I talk a lot about when I take, again, maybe new professionals to like their first conference or those kind of things, we have some of those conversations, about like, okay, what does it mean to, represent us as an institution, whether that's just in the day-to-day activities, what does it mean when you kind of present? Again, the standard that I always kind of show, and similar to what I'm doing now, I'm always probably wearing something with Morehead State on me. More often than not, our name badges at conferences have those school names on there. And so kind of what that representation does, but also keep in mind kind of the places we've been, kind of the journey that we carry and how we do those things and how we reflect those opportunities as well. And so, and again, when we talk about references and referrals, that's just as big. Like I said, my example kind of tailors to a little bit of that. But when we think about, the people who we ask, I mean, fingers crossed you're asking when you ask someone to be a reference for you. Just that's best care for you. But when, those people are saying, yes, I'm willing to be a reference for you, we become that representation, of them. They're willing to kind of, vouch for us and kind of, we represent kind of their word that they're going to be, that we can kind of perform the roles or act in a way that's going to reflect not only on ourselves, but them. And I think the same way happens when we choose to be references for other people. Some of that is, taking the care to say like, hey, am I willing to, serve as a reference for this person? Again, fingers crossed, when they put you as a reference, they are asking that, if you are willing to serve as a positive reference for them. But again, something that kind of keeps in mind in terms of what we talk about with kind of that representation that we have. It's not just where we are in the here and now, but it's that legacy that we have, and it's kind of those different roles and those different stops that we carry, and how those different places are going to be a reflection of those places. Again, the degrees that we hold, the places that we've been, the individuals that are willing to serve as references or kind of serve as those recommendations for us. And thinking about kind of how some of those things will show up and kind of how they look as we interact with other people. Because again, not only are we forming those opinions based on those interactions we have, but then other people are going to form those interactions based those opinions on the interactions that they have with us. And so again, it's always a little something that I can always advise, especially with kind of new professionals, when we talk a little bit about kind of representation, and kind of think about that. It's not just where you are in the here and now, but kind of the journey that you had and kind of those stops that you've been able to have and kind of how that all accumulates to where you are and kind of how you can kind of represent those, and put forth the best face for a lot of those things as well. So, yeah. And so kind of as I transition kind of into the next piece, and this kind of goes back, ties in a little bit with kind of like, hey, moving forward in the journey, but kind of thinking about how things may look a little bit, or kind of how you kind of carry some of those ideas and some of those lessons with you. Talked a little bit about kind of growing up outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And one of the things that kind of started there and is very much kind of carried with me throughout a lot of my career and my travels was working as a soccer referee. Both for youth and then kind of working out through different channels. And so, I remember when I started out kind of doing that, a lot of kind of trying to learn some of the ways to do that, whether it was just how to apply things, how to manage a game, those kind of things, with watching like the people who have been more experienced, kind of I can use the term adults because I started doing this at like 14, 16 years old. But looking at those individuals who have kind of been referees for a long amount of time and kind of seeing how they do things, some of the tricks that they do, and kind of be able to kind of pick up some of those things that would kind of help me, develop as a referee. But there were some things where, when I would go out and maybe try something that I've seen, didn't get the exact same response from that. And so it may, maybe a little bit adversarial coach, parents reacting maybe a little bit not super thrilled with some certain circumstances. And some of that for me was trying to process, okay, well, it worked for them. Why didn't it work for me? And then a lot of it was as you kind of sit down and having some of the conversations and kind of learn about, learning from those experienced individuals. It was learning that on the concept of some things aren't as easy as kind of cutting and pasting. Sometimes, that credibility is earned because they've taken the time to develop themselves, or they have that level of seniority and that experience. They've built those relationships over time. And so that was kind of really that lesson of, okay, well, maybe there's some things that this person who's been doing this for 20 years, and they're kind of recognizable, figure they can get away with doing this or joking around or, conducting themselves in a little bit certain way, versus me as, again, a 16-year-old kid, maybe interpret a little bit differently. And so when I talk about that and think about that's how that's kind of carried forward throughout my career, it's this understanding of kind of how we earn credibility, in our roles, and kind of where does that come from in different things. And it comes from a lot of different places. There are some areas where a little bit of that credibility is assumed. When we hold a certain position, there may be some people, okay, well, this person has been put in this position. There's a level of credibility that comes within that. But when we think about kind of where some of those other areas of credibility come in and kind of where some of those things come in, again, it comes through the experiences that we have. Again, we talked about like the individuals who vouch for you and kind of how maybe their credibility can transition onto you. Again, organizations, we look at resumes and think, okay, this person's been really involved at this level, or they've participated in these kind of activities or kind of trainings. That adds to that, some of those things. Again, I talked a little bit like about longevity and kind of what that looks like. And so, but it's something to kind of very much kind of keep in mind when we talk about how that looks or kind of what that means to kind of have that credibility. Several years ago, I was having a conversation with a hall director, and I'd been around the department a couple of years, and this person had kind of just started there in that hall director role, and we were having a conversation just about different things, and that this hall director was talking about, it's like, yeah, it's like, they keep talking about, oh, not wanting to like let down, John, in this case, me, as someone else in kind of the department, just that they've had previous interactions with. And that this hall director was kind of saying like, well, how do I get there? I want them to be able to kind of have that respect for me. And, some of that was unpacking that conversation. It was like, well, I've got a little bit of a head start on you. They've got a little bit more of a relationship with me. And kind of going through like, well, how do we develop that credibility? How do we build into some of those things? And so I'm sure a lot of us can relate to kind of that situation of starting as a hall director or starting in a position and inheriting that staff that we had little to no influence on selecting. And so, again, there's going to be some of that comes in, okay, well, here's the new hall director, but then how do we go about developing that credibility amongst that staff, amongst those individuals on that team within that? And really, when we talk about the core credibility, we're talking about trust. How do we develop that trust amongst these individuals? Again, some of it is going to come inherently through some like the people who speak with us or like positions we hold, but a lot of that is going to be kind of how we navigate some of that. And the question that I always ask people when we talk about trust and how that extends to credibility is this idea of, how do you develop trust in others? I think a lot of times we think about trust as like, well, this is how I've come to trust this person. This is kind of where how I've learned to trust them. And again, that can come through their credibility as well. But I think a lot of times it's a little more difficult to kind of take that step back and think about those situations where I feel like this person trusts me now. How did I do that? How did I accomplish that where now I said this person has that trust in me? And it can look very different from person to person. Some people are very good at going out there and they develop these relationships, have these conversations, to really develop, have empathy right at the top of, I'm a certified Clifton Strengths coach, so the empathy is right there near the top of their strengths. And so I said, some people, like I said, they develop that trust, they develop that credibility by developing those relationships. For myself, I always kind of talk to people about how I develop trust. And when I think about the times that I've developed trust through a lot of people, it's usually through the work that I do and people being able to kind of see, like, putting in the effort, the outcomes, the qualities of those kind of things. That tends to be how I have developed trust amongst coworkers, amongst individuals, and kind of showing those acts and kind of showing those things, versus, like I said, having conversations or developing relationships. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the two are mutually exclusive, but it kind of shows up in kind of thinking about, that idea of like, when these people start to trust me, how did that happen? How did that play out, and kind of what that has looked like? And again, some of that is, like I said, it happens over time. It's one of those things where I'm sure even, a senior housing officer who has maybe transitioned to a different institution can tell you, while there's some credibility that's going to come with being kind of that senior role, there's going to be some credibility and some trust that's going to be built amongst the people now that they are in a new environment, and kind of understanding, well, how do I integrate what I do, my experiences, into this new environment, into this new setting, to do some of those things. And so and we talk a lot about, like I said, what that credibility is. It is recognizing that it is something that maybe necessarily you flip a switch and suddenly we have that credibility and things kind of work out, in a certain way. It's something that's going to take a little bit of time to earn. It's something that's going to take through some of the things that we do, whether it's, in the position that we hold and how we develop those relationships with our colleagues, with the people that we supervise, the people across our campus. When we step into, roles in like organizations, what does it look like to have that credibility to be able to kind of execute the responsibilities that we've taken on. But like I said, the important thing, like I said, the thing that I always stress to especially new professionals when I have this conversation with them, is knowing that that's going to be built over time. You're going to earn that credibility, you're going to build that credibility, and then that's going to allow you to do more things. There are many times where, I respond to like an on-call situation and I'm working with RAs to kind of help resolve that thing. And there are things that, that we do and kind of we work through to navigate the situation. And as I'm debriefing with them after the fact, there may be times where I sit there and say like, hey, just as an FYI, what you saw, I could get away with that because of kind of the position that I hold. I've got a little more credibility and experience versus, like, again, if an RA tried to do that, it may be perceived a very different way in terms of kind of how to manage that situation. And so sometimes, like I say, it's good to be able to kind of talk through some of those situations, especially as you debrief in certain circumstances or have conversations with individuals about different circumstances. Some of that context is important. Again, I'll reference my strength. My strength context is at the top of my strengths. And so like I said, sometimes putting some of those things into context and understanding that context can understand how that credibility is built, and kind of knowing when you may be able to have the credibility to maybe have a more frank conversation with a parent or a student versus with somebody else who may not necessarily have that level of comfortability or have some of that credibility to be able to kind of do some of those things. But again, I'll circle back to that. How do you build trust? And like I said, and that's what I would encourage everybody to really think about. Those times when you feel these people trust me, how did you do that? Because that's going to be one of the best skills that you can kind of think about and transfer going forward in any place that you go. How is it that I go about in building that trust in others so that I can kind of build that credibility? That again, that's going to allow people to trust me, provide those recommendations as we kind of go through and navigate situations, navigate to new positions. What does that look like? How does that play out? And kind of how can we can build that credibility that will help us, and by extension, help others kind of going forward with things. And so again, at the core of a lot of things, but again, it's also trusting in yourself that you can kind of build that over time, and knowing that trust that you can kind of have, that not everything is going to happen overnight, and that some things will happen, with each experience, with each opportunity, and going from there to learn some of those things. So, yeah. So talked a little bit about kind of selection stuff and kind of being on the selector side of kind of that process. Kind of the next kind of area that I'm kind of going to delve into and kind of highlight comes from a little bit being not so much on the selector, but kind of having an opportunity to be a part of those selection processes as well. And again, I talked a little bit about kind of having a degree of folklore. My other bachelor's degree is in business. And for anyone who's ever gone through business school, there's probably at least one or more sections where they talk about how you build your resume or how you format that resume, what that needs to look like, and kind of what that is. And so, I went through that, and kind of maintained my resume, always kind of adhered to those kind of quick standards of, okay, keep everything tight, concise, no more than 1 or 2 pages, kind of took that forward as, kind of went from undergrad to grad school and starting out in the professional world. And then, it was a situation of like, okay, well, as I'm getting more of these experiences, how do I continue to add those to that resume, but also make sure I'm continuing to communicate the quality of those experiences. And that started to become a struggle again, kind of the further along I got in the journey, and kind of thinking, okay, well, again, I'm trying to keep this resume as I'm always been taught, but experiences are growing and there's more quality I want to highlight. And it wasn't until I actually started to have the opportunity to kind of be a part of like senior housing officer or like senior student affairs officers processes, and whether that was be able to kind of give feedback as part of the process or being a part of like open forums where they provide you with the candidates materials, that it kind of clicked on me that, oh, I have a resume, but now what I'm seeing for these positions and these materials, these are CVs, something that's a little bit different from those kind of things. And so from there, it was kind of that realization of, oh, well, something that I was always conscious of, kind of working in an academic environment, but kind of really how that the academic ideas also kind of migrate their way over into student affairs as well, and kind of what that can look like, kind of how some of those things kind of balance out a little bit. And so I think that was a very eye-opening kind of piece in terms of thinking out like, where is that overlap between kind of the academics and kind of the student affairs? Because again, I'm sure everyone's kind of a little bit familiar with at least some of those kind of conversations of like, okay, here's academics, here's student affairs, here's like faculty, here's kind of the staff kind of side, and that kind of interesting balance that happens on a lot of universities. But really kind of where those lines are very gray, especially kind of when we talk about kind of student affairs and kind of how some of the things happen with us. And so, you know, and that's kind of the other thing that I kind of start to highlight with a lot of people is that when we talk about like our careers are in academics, are working on academic institutions, especially where a lot of us are probably ingrained in kind of a curricular approach to what we do. That idea of kind of how the academic side kind of starts to bleed over into student affairs really kind of talks to like a lot of the things that we do and kind of how to kind of think about a lot of the things that we do. So when we think about that kind of academic side of the house, you know, for anyone who's kind of gone through different systems or kind of come through different things, you know, you hear a lot about kind of the three areas where like faculty kind of really get evaluated, or kind of those kind of areas of responsibility that pop up for them. And so you see a lot of this, like the teaching, research, service, especially for those who are going through that tenure process. Usually, you know, these are kind of those areas that tend to pop up a lot. And again, the degree to which these kind of take emphasis can kind of depend on, you know, the school that somebody is at, the discipline that they're in. And so the balance of kind of teaching, research, service can kind of vary. It's very rarely is there a situation where it's like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. There's usually a different balance in those kind of things. And faculty, you know, it's one of those things where they're kind of told, you know, like, hey, you know, to, you know, get tenure, here's kind of how to balance those things, or here's what the, you know, those groups are going to be looking for with some of those things. And so, and like I said, for me, a lot of it was you kind of sit down and think, okay, well, we know this is faculty kind of, and then think about what it looks like kind of for professional side. It's like, well, when you think about kind of, especially student affairs, not too dissimilar in terms of kind of a lot of the areas where a lot of our kind of focus or kind of a lot of our balance kind of comes in as well. And so when we think about kind of this idea in student affairs where we have kind of the position that we hold, we talk a lot about the professional development side of what we do. And then there's also kind of that service side of our industry as well. And so again, more often than not, that position is probably going to be the one that carries the most weight to make sure that we do some of those things and make sure we kind of take care of our own work and those kind of things. But there's also that balance of like when we talk about like how are we growing as individuals, what professional development looks like, what service to our industry looks like. As I'm sure, you know, those of us who are coming to a conference and those who have ever served in kind of the those leadership positions at a conference, you know, service to our industry is something that can be very highly valued in a lot of places, and kind of giving back to those. I mean, very rarely are those positions paid or compensated positions. It's usually that's something where we're volunteering our time or volunteering our efforts to be able to do those things. And so again, and very similar, like I said, where I said faculty can have this balance depending on the school, depending on the discipline, depending on their department. That's very true in student affairs as well. And it's one of those things where if you look at and really start to do your research, if you're like potentially job searching or you're looking to kind of look at your own institution and kind of start to see kind of what is the balance that my department, my institution, or this potential department or institution, what are they looking for in those kind of things? And when you sit there and look at like what a position description says, I mean, I can speak to a lot of our positions here at Morehead State. We actually have a line in our job description that talks about professional development and service to our industry. And it's something we do put a value on as part of our positions. Again, yeah, we have our position description, we have the responsibilities and expectations here, but we also greatly encourage that. How do you seek development? How do you give back to kind of our industry? And so that's something that is a part of kind of our values and kind of how we build that in. But again, when you look at kind of your department, you look at kind of other departments, you can usually see where that balance is. You can kind of usually see, like, you know, at a conference, are we seeing a lot of people from a particular institution where they're willing to invest in sending their staff to these developmental events? When you look at publications, when you look at individuals who hold leadership positions in organizations, are you seeing a particular school pop up more often than not? Again, when you're interviewing, you know, for a position, you know, talk about kind of what is that balance of, you know, development and service with this position that I'm looking at. And so, like I say, it was very interesting again as that realization comes in of like, okay, well, we know kind of faculty, it's very similar in student affairs, and like I said, that comes with being in an area of working in academics and kind of how again that's the academics and the classroom side kind of bleeds over kind of into kind of how we do and maybe how we can think about our positions and how to balance out a lot of that stuff. And so, and again, like I said, the conversations that I have, you know, with new professionals, very much kind of talks about that. Like I said, we're going to talk about your position. We're going to talk about what development looks like for you. Where are your areas are you interested in getting involved in those kind of things? And so really kind of allowing them to kind of figure out what is that balance need to look at, because not only is it necessarily our own interest, but again, the interests of our department, of our institution as well, and kind of where those values may kind of come within that, and kind of thinking, okay, well, how do I balance those things? Because again, this is all going to add up to 100%. And so thinking about where does the percentage of my time may fall within some of those things to truly do that. So, and again, when it comes to these things, again, my story kind of started looking at kind of resumes and CVs, and that realization for me of, I've got the wrong document that I'm trying to sell myself with in our industry. And so, and again, it's somewhere, I mean, we throw out these two words. I think a lot of them kind of get used interchangeably when we talk about like resumes and a CV and those kind of things. And so always kind of pull this and kind of share this. I think it's a good, like, just kind of quick example of kind of when we talk about the difference between those two documents, kind of what does that actually look like? Like I said, you know, for me, my training was resume, keep it tight, kind of, you know, highlight your experiences, you know, emphasize the skills. Again, 1 to 2 pages, minimize the amount of white space you have on those documents. And kind of, again, how that evolves for kind of different areas within that, you know, especially like that last bullet point where okay, you've got the education, now you're in the experience realm, emphasize the experience. But for any of us who have kind of gone through any serious level of job searches in the past, you know, we know that's not necessarily how our documents get reviewed or kind of how people look at that. I'm sure most of the job descriptions we look at, or anyone has looked at here, no, usually one of the first qualifications that gets listed is degree. You know, they look for that educational background to kind of, they meet that kind of that threshold. So again, that's something, that education is usually going to be up there first, to be able to do that. And again, that's more consistent with a CV, especially the longer you go along the lines. And I think especially with a CV, you know, it's recognizing that it doesn't necessarily have to be this certain length. You're not necessarily, okay, 1 to 2 pages, don't go anymore. It can be longer within that, because theoretically, as you go along in your career, you're going to build up more of those quality experiences. You're going to build up more of those quality opportunities and that you want to be able to highlight. And it's more than just, okay, well, here's the school I got my degree from. Here's the experience that I have in these jobs. You know, it can encompass things like presenting at a conference, getting published in a work, you know, advising experience, classes we've maybe been a part of or taught. It can encompass different things, and it's going to grow with time. And I think the point that's on this slide of length very much depends on experience. I recently participated in kind of a group that for reviewing kind of resumes and application materials for new professionals in our area. And one of the documents that got submitted by a professional who less than 2 years experience submitted this 16-page CV. And I was like, oh, that's a lot. But I think a lot of that, for kind of knowing someone with kind of that length of experience and kind of the document that was submitted to us, my feedback for them wasn't necessarily like, wow, this is a lot, and kind of like within that, it was, you might have a lot of quality experience in here, but it gets lost in all this long list of things relative to kind of where you are, maybe in your experience. And so maybe condense some of this stuff down to highlight more of that quality in there, while highlighting some of the depth of the experiences as well. And so I said, that's kind of something that's kind of always important to kind of, that I kind of share. It's like there is kind of a balance of length. There isn't necessarily saying like, hey, here's how short or long it has to be, but kind of make sure you're highlighting the quality in those as well. Make sure there's a consistent formatting throughout it as well. And so, and thinking about, again, it is more of a kind of that academic focused kind of work. And so keeping in mind, hey, when you put like a conference presentation or you put a publication, you want to put it in there as if you were citing it in like an academic work. And so again, so like this, if I'm going to, when I put this or add this to this presentation to my CV, it's going to be formatted in APA format, just because again, more of an academic mindset within that. If people want to go back and reference it, here's kind of how it would be cited and those kind of things. But that consistency of kind of how you cite things and kind of making sure it's in there is important. But like I said, and that's really when we talk about the difference between a resume and a CV. And there are more, we can go more in depth in terms of like formatting and kind of what those things look like. That's a whole different session within that. But more kind of emphasizing that mindset of, we work in academic environments. How do we present and kind of show those things that maintain kind of that academic focus, but are more also responsible towards kind of, we talk about kind of that professional balance as well with things. And so again, always make sure I try and highlight that with individuals, because then I say you see a lot of that light bulb moments where it's like, oh, that makes sense. And now they're not constrained kind of like to these ideas of, okay, nice concise resume. How do you have that CV and kind of how you present that balance of your position, your development, your service, and those other things that kind of go along with that. So, yeah. If I were doing this session in person, this would be the time where I pull out my cell phone and actually set it off to ring. Because for anyone who has ever been with a group of housing professionals and suddenly a cell phone goes off, suddenly everybody, what? And they have that second of, wait, is that my phone? And then there's that quick wave of realization, oh, it's not me, it's somebody else. And again, and I gotta always talk, I always give the analogy of like Pavlov's dog, of like, you ring the bell and you generate a reaction. It's, for us, I always use that as an example of when we talk about this work-life balance of kind of what work life does to us and some of those things. And so, and think about, what that looks like for that, because it's, again, something that comes up and, is talked a lot about in our industry. And so for me, that's kind of that example of just how that balance gets very blurred in a lot of different ways. But for me, when I talk about people, I always kind of talk about the myth of work-life balance. And before I delve into that, I want to make sure I clarify, I'm not saying work-life balance is a myth. That is very important. But I think there are some myths that are tied to it. And so I think for me, especially when I talk with people, the myth of work-life balance is that there always needs to be this balance. At any moment in time, you need to have balance. And so if you think about this concept of a teeter-totter, everything always needs to be centered and kind of where that is. And so we always need to know, okay, work and life and balance, everything at any moment, at all times, we need to have that balance. I think we know, working in student housing, that there are times things are a little bit heavier than others, and where sometimes, we got a little more one way or the other, and, especially when we hit kind of those opening or closing periods. There tends to be a little more on the plate with a lot of those different things. And so when we talk about, like I said, for me, that myth of we always have to do this, when those times get a little imbalanced, things can look like this, where one side has a little more weight than the other. And where burnout tends to happen is when people try and maintain this balance where the weight is unequal. And you're trying to figure out, well, how do I do this? And how do I, maintain kind of this balance, even though more is on this side and this is on the other. And for this graphic, I very intentionally don't label work or life, because I think more often the other myth that comes with this is that work is the thing that tends to unbalance the work-life balance, when I think many of us know life can have just as much of an impact as work some of those times. But again, I think like that, and using this as an example to really talk about, there are times things are going to be out of balance. Things are going to have a little more weight than others. And trying to maintain this balance, that is going to be an incredible amount of work and stress and burnout when you try and figure out how to keep everything equal, even when there's different weights on that teeter-totter. And so as we think about some of those things and kind of how to do some of that, for me, the advice that I always give people in terms of knowing that balance is being present in the moment, but also knowing the bigger picture. If we know this moment is going to be heavier, so like opening, in the conversations that I have with my staff and then my conversations I have with my director, I know this work, I'm going to be putting in a lot of time here. How do I take some time to relax later? Or how do I do some time to kind of relax in advance to be able to kind of do something, and knowing kind of how I balance out in the big picture, so that yes, while this teeter-totter is moving up and down, I'm working with it. I'm moving up and down with it. And so knowing, okay, things are coming, or maybe, I had a late on call night, being able to say, hey, I know there's a window of time here where I can kind of maybe de-stress or kind of know some of those things. But also some of that being able to do that comes with familiarizing yourself with your options and your resources. And I very intentionally tell that to people of take that initiative to do that yourself. You are going to know how you can manage your time. You are going to know your limits. You are going to know how much you can take on more than anybody else. So know those resources, know those limits, have those conversations with a supervisor, have those conversations with people who can provide those levels of support. And knowing kind of how you can do that. There are times when I was a hall director where I would tell my staff just, hey, tonight I'm not on call. I just kind of need that night. I'm going to be in my apartment doing whatever, just kind of relaxing. If the hall starts burning down, sound the alarm and I'll help. But just I need kind of that one night. Here's who to contact if stuff comes up. And just being transparent, but knowing kind of how we can balance those things. And then again, being able to kind of prioritize, focus, and follow through with things. Again, being able to say, okay, I'm going to concentrate on this, get this done. Here's the next thing. Here's the next thing. And then following through on those things. That's going to kind of help people be able to kind of prioritize and kind of navigate through some of those stressful times and get to kind of those kind of down times. Because again, you're able to kind of follow through, be able to kind of look at this, know what's going on, did this, everything's good. You have that sense of relief and satisfaction that we've gotten through some of those things. Because again, when you think about that balance and that teeter-totters are supposed to be fun. You're supposed to have fun riding kind of that drive and being able to kind of go up and down and enjoying kind of navigating through some of that process as well. And so, but that's kind of the important thing is kind of, again, that this idea that like I said, at all times kind of things need to be balanced. We know that's not going to happen. So find that time and use those resources that are kind of going to help balance out the bigger picture versus kind of just here's what's happening in the moment and some of those things. And so with all of that, like I said, if I give you kind of how to maximize your journey or kind of the best piece of advice and kind of how to put all of these things together and advice. The first thing is always identifying a mentor. And when I say that, it's, a mentor is someone beyond, hey, here's the person I go to ask a question to, or somebody that I do have trust because they have credibility. Those mentors are people who are going to invest in you, are going to give you honest feedback, are invested in your development and invested in you as an individual. And so kind of what that looks like, finding those people that are going to be invested in you, are going to be able to be willing and able to help you navigate through your journey within that. Taking the time to learn. Like I said, we talked a lot about like credibility and those kind of things. Understanding kind of how those things can play out, understand context, understand when you can then apply certain things. Taking that time to learn becomes so important. I know so many of us want to jump in and be able to kind of start doing things and kind of being able to apply those things. But sometimes understanding context, understanding your environment, taking that time to learn will truly inform you how you can then integrate everything and the value that you bring into your environment, into the context around you. And then again, I'll follow up on that idea of kind of focus, what it means to focus on like here, how I can concentrate on doing this one thing versus trying to spread out your efforts over 3, 6, 9, 12 different things, and kind of seeing some of those things that can kind of play out a different way. Take the time to really invest in kind of what you're doing, take the time to really focus on here's the quality I can get from this thing versus having a quantity of things that may kind of come together with a lot of different pieces. And so those are things like as you think about kind of how, or in the advice especially that I give to individuals, like how you put these things together, those are really kind of the core elements that kind of really tie together with a lot of that, of finding those people who are willing to invest in you, taking that time to grow and learn, and then taking the time to focus on the quality of those things within that. Theoretically, we all are going to have long careers, and we're going to have time to be able to kind of do those things, and we can kind of take those things one step at a time and really utilize those people that are going to help us along on that journey. So yeah, that is what I have. I can, any questions, I mean, we'll field questions now if any questions or clarifications on things here. But if anything pops up, I mean, there's my contact information. Don't hesitate to kind of share that. And just as a side note, I very intentionally included my pronouns at the end of the slide, because I think that is another thing where we learn how to do that just over the course of observing people. That's been another learning experience over the course of our careers, when to introduce those things, when to kind of share those ideas. And so again, as we've gone through the process of kind of how you kind of learn and adapt over time, I think that's another perfect example of kind of how we learn and kind of adapt to ingrain that into a lot of the things that we do and a lot of those ideas within that. So yeah, with that, like I said, if there are any questions, I will open it up for the remaining time that we have to be able to kind of provide any answers, clarifications, anything like that.
I think I have a question.
Go for it.
This may be a juvenile question, but do you think that the name of the school has strong influence on like the marketability of candidates, especially for like entry level positions?
It can, because the school's name is always going to be tied to its reputation. The important thing about a reputation is it's very rarely what's happening in the here and now, and more so what you've been able to do over a longer period of time. And so I think that's the important thing, of, whether it's a school that you're looking at or even the school that you're at right now. I mean, very much, a reputation can be tied to a name as well. And again, we're going to know from people that we've worked with, experiences that we may have had. It could be even experiences we've had as we're interviewing with the school. That's going to influence our mindset, and then we may share those experiences with other people, and that's going to influence how they view those schools. And so it's very possible, because again, every school is going to have that reputation tied to it based on the experiences that we have or the things that we see. And so, I think part of it, and as again, I will strike this as having a business degree in marketing, some of our encouragement for our staff here at Morehead State to go out, be involved in organizations and do things on a professional level beyond our institution is to help build the reputation of our institution and our department. Because again, having those quality things out there and kind of how we show that can have that impact on the name of our school. Even where with our RHA and our NRHH, encouraging them to go out and submit nominations for like OTMs and awards. That's going to help the name brand of our school, because now it's out there and it's being associated with positive things. So a little bit of a long way to say, yes, a name can be influencing and have an impact on those kind of things. But I think a lot of that also comes with the reputation and association that gets shared with that name.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone to fill out the program session evaluation. I'm sure you've heard that at every session you've been to, but I just put it in the chat. And thank you so much for all this information, John.
All right. Yeah, thank you all for attending. Again, if any questions pop up after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out.